On March 11, 2011, the world witnessed one of the largest technological disasters of the 21st century. What began as a powerful earthquake off the coast of Japan turned within hours into a nuclear crisis that kept millions of people glued to the news. The disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant became the most serious nuclear accident since Chernobyl. It changed the way many countries viewed nuclear energy, forced the evacuation of thousands of residents, and left consequences that are still being felt today. To understand how this tragedy became possible, we must return to a country that had long been considered a symbol of technological progress and engineering excellence. Japan is located at the meeting point of several tectonic plates. As a result, earthquakes are a regular part of life. Every year, the country experiences thousands of seismic events. Most are so weak that people barely notice them, while others are strong enough to damage buildings and infrastructure. Because of this constant threat, Japanese engineers spent decades developing some of the world's most advanced earthquake-resistant construction techniques. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant was built on the eastern coast of Honshu Island, directly facing the Pacific Ocean. Construction began in the late 1960s, and the first reactor started operating in 1971. Over time, the facility expanded to 6 nuclear reactors, supplying electricity to millions of homes and businesses. The plant was operated by the Tokyo Electric Power Company, better known as TEPCO. For decades, Fukushima Daiichi was considered a modern and reliable nuclear power station. It underwent regular safety inspections, and its employees were trained to respond to emergency situations. Engineers were confident that even a major earthquake would not lead to a catastrophe because the reactors would automatically shut down while backup systems continued cooling them. But there was one danger that had been underestimated: the ocean. On March 11, 2011, at 2:46 p.m. local time, one of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded history struck off the northeastern coast of Japan. It measured approximately magnitude 9.0. Massive sections of the Earth's crust shifted by dozens of meters, releasing an unimaginable amount of energy. The earthquake was felt across a vast area of the country. Buildings swayed violently for several minutes. Cars came to a stop in the middle of roads. People rushed into open spaces, knowing that powerful aftershocks could follow at any moment. At Fukushima Daiichi, the safety systems responded exactly as they had been designed to. Reactors 1, 2, and 3, which were operating at the time, automatically shut down. Reactors 4, 5, and 6 were already offline for scheduled maintenance. For a brief moment, it seemed that the worst had been avoided. However, even after a nuclear reactor is shut down, the fuel inside continues producing an enormous amount of residual heat. That is why the reactor core must be cooled continuously. Without cooling, temperatures begin rising rapidly, eventually leading to a nuclear fuel meltdown. After the earthquake, the external power lines supplying the plant were severely damaged. But this situation had already been anticipated in the plant's design. Within seconds, emergency diesel generators automatically started, providing electricity to the cooling pumps. The workers breathed a sigh of relief. Everything appeared to be functioning exactly as intended. But dozens of kilometers offshore, another threat was already taking shape. The violent movement of the ocean floor had generated a massive tsunami. The enormous wave raced toward Japan's coastline at the speed of a jet aircraft. Japan's advanced early warning system detected the danger almost immediately. Television stations, radio broadcasts, and mobile phone alerts urged residents to evacuate to higher ground without delay. For many people, only a few minutes remained. When the first waves reached the coast, they swept away everything in their path. Cars, houses, fishing boats, trains, and entire neighborhoods were carried inland by the overwhelming force of the water. Communities that had stood for generations disappeared within minutes. At Fukushima Daiichi, a seawall had been constructed to protect the facility. Engineers believed it would be sufficient to withstand a tsunami of approximately 6 meters. Nature had other plans. The tsunami that struck the plant exceeded 13 meters in height. The enormous wall of water crashed over the seawall and flooded the entire nuclear power station within seconds. It was at that moment that the situation began slipping out of control. Seawater poured into buildings housing the emergency diesel generators and electrical equipment. One by one, the generators failed as they were submerged beneath the floodwaters. The plant suddenly lost its emergency power. This was the scenario that few engineers had truly expected. Without electricity, the cooling pumps stopped operating. Only battery-powered backup systems remained, but they could provide power for only a limited amount of time. Inside the control rooms, warning alarms began sounding one after another. The water level inside the reactor pressure vessels slowly began to fall. Temperatures started rising. The operators immediately searched for every possible way to restore electrical power. Mobile generators were dispatched toward the station, but roads had been destroyed by the earthquake and flooded by the tsunami. Delivering the equipment proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, conditions inside the reactors continued to deteriorate with every passing minute. When nuclear fuel assemblies are no longer adequately cooled, their temperatures can exceed 1,000 degrees Celsius. The zirconium alloy surrounding the fuel rods reacts with steam under these extreme conditions. This chemical reaction produces hydrogen gas. Hydrogen is highly explosive, and within hours, it would become the cause of dramatic explosions that would shock the entire world. As the hours passed, the situation at Fukushima Daiichi grew increasingly desperate. Engineers fought against time, but every minute without reliable cooling pushed the reactors closer to disaster. Inside Reactor Unit 1, temperatures continued to rise at an alarming rate. Water levels dropped as steam filled the reactor pressure vessel. Eventually, the nuclear fuel was no longer completely covered by water. The exposed fuel assemblies became dangerously hot, beginning to melt through their protective cladding. Operators knew exactly what this meant. A core meltdown had begun. The only hope was to restore cooling before irreversible damage spread further. However, with electrical systems disabled and communication becoming increasingly difficult, every decision had to be made under extreme pressure. Meanwhile, hydrogen gas continued accumulating inside the reactor building. Since the ventilation systems were no longer functioning normally, the gas had nowhere to escape. On the afternoon of March 12th, disaster struck. A powerful explosion ripped through the upper section of Reactor Building 1. Television cameras captured the dramatic moment as a massive white cloud burst into the sky. Around the world, millions watched in disbelief. For many viewers, the explosion looked like a nuclear detonation. Fortunately, it was not. The reactor's containment vessel remained largely intact, but the hydrogen explosion destroyed the outer walls and roof of the building. Even so, radioactive materials were released into the atmosphere, increasing concern among Japanese authorities and the international community. Soon after the explosion, the Japanese government expanded the evacuation zone surrounding the power plant. Thousands of residents had already fled their homes following the tsunami. Now tens of thousands more were ordered to leave because of the growing nuclear emergency. Many families departed with only a few belongings. They believed they would return home within days. Some would never return. Inside the station, workers continued risking their lives to prevent an even greater catastrophe. They became known around the world as the Fukushima 50, although the actual number of personnel constantly changed as teams rotated in and out of the hazardous area. Despite intense radiation levels, exhaustion, and uncertainty, these engineers, firefighters, and technicians remained at the plant. Their mission was simple: Prevent the complete destruction of the reactors. One of the most difficult decisions involved injecting seawater directly into the reactors. Normally, nuclear reactors use highly purified water for cooling. Pumping corrosive seawater into the reactor would permanently destroy it, making future operation impossible. But by this point, saving the reactors was no longer the priority. Saving lives was. After receiving government approval, operators began injecting seawater mixed with boric acid into reactor Unit 1. The boric acid helped absorb neutrons, reducing any possibility of renewed nuclear fission inside the damaged core. Still, the crisis was far from over. Reactors 2 and 3 were experiencing similar problems. Cooling systems continued failing. Pressure inside the containment vessels kept increasing. Hydrogen gas accumulated once again. On March 14, another violent explosion shattered Reactor Building 3. The blast was even more powerful than the first. Concrete panels, steel beams, and debris were hurled hundreds of meters into the air. Several workers were injured. Emergency crews struggled to continue their operations amid the destruction. Around the world, fears of another Chernobyl began spreading. News organizations provided continuous live coverage. Experts debated whether the containment structures would survive. Governments advised their citizens in Japan to remain cautious. As international concern grew, Reactor Unit 2 also entered a critical phase. Unlike the previous explosions, this reactor suffered severe damage inside its suppression chamber, an important part of the containment system designed to control pressure during emergencies. Radiation levels around the station increased significantly. At the same time, another unexpected problem emerged. Reactor Building 4, although its reactor had been shut down for maintenance before the earthquake, also experienced a hydrogen explosion. The hydrogen had most likely traveled from neighboring systems and accumulated inside the building. The explosion caused additional structural damage and intensified fears that the entire nuclear power station might become uncontrollable. Authorities now faced one of the greatest emergency responses in modern Japanese history. Helicopters attempted to drop seawater onto damaged reactor buildings. Military vehicles equipped with high-pressure water cannons approached the site. Firefighters worked under dangerous radiation conditions, spraying thousands of tons of water into the reactors and spent fuel pools. Every operation carried enormous risk. Yet every successful cooling effort bought precious time. By now, hundreds of thousands of people had been evacuated from surrounding communities. Entire towns stood empty. Schools, hospitals, businesses, and homes were abandoned almost overnight. Radiation monitoring stations continuously measured contamination levels across northeastern Japan. Fortunately, changing wind patterns and emergency response measures prevented an even larger release of radioactive material than many experts had feared. Nevertheless, radioactive iodine and cesium were detected in the air, soil, drinking water, agricultural products, and nearby seawater. Fishing activities were suspended in many coastal regions. Food inspections became routine. The disaster was no longer confined to the power plant. Its effects were spreading across the surrounding environment. Despite the overwhelming challenges, workers gradually succeeded in stabilizing some of the reactors. Emergency cooling efforts slowed the rise in temperature. Although the reactor cores had already suffered extensive damage, preventing further overheating became the immediate objective. The world watched anxiously, wondering whether Japan could stop the crisis before another catastrophic release of radiation occurred. The battle was far from over. The coming weeks would determine not only the future of Fukushima Daiichi, but also the future of nuclear energy around the world. In the days that followed, the immediate danger of an uncontrolled nuclear catastrophe slowly began to decrease. Continuous cooling efforts, emergency engineering measures, and the determination of thousands of workers prevented an even greater disaster. However, the crisis was far from over. Investigations soon confirmed the worst fears. The nuclear fuel inside reactors 1, 2, and 3 had suffered partial or extensive meltdowns. Temperatures had become so extreme that portions of the fuel melted through their original structures, severely damaging the reactor cores. Although the containment systems prevented a complete release of radioactive material on the scale of Chernobyl, significant amounts of radioactive substances had already escaped into the environment. Radiation spread through the air, settled on the surrounding land, and entered nearby rivers and the Pacific Ocean. Japanese authorities immediately expanded environmental monitoring. Scientists collected thousands of samples from soil, seawater, crops, milk, drinking water, and wildlife to determine the extent of contamination. The evacuation zone around the plant remained in place. More than 150,000 residents had been forced to leave their homes. Entire communities became silent overnight. Schools were closed, businesses shut down, and streets that had once been full of life stood completely empty. For many families, the evacuation was heartbreaking. People left behind their homes, family photographs, farms, pets, and personal belongings, believing they would return within days or weeks. Instead, many spent years living in temporary housing. Some communities would never again be permanently inhabited. While the public focused on the damaged reactors, another enormous challenge emerged. Every day, huge amounts of water were pumped through the reactors to keep the melted fuel cool. This water became contaminated with radioactive materials. Engineers had to collect, store, and later treat hundreds of thousands of tons of radioactive water. Massive storage tanks were built across the Fukushima site. Year after year, more tanks covered the facility, creating one of the world's largest collections of treated radioactive water. Removing the damaged nuclear fuel proved to be an even greater engineering challenge. The intense radiation inside the reactors made it impossible for workers to enter many areas safely. Instead, specially designed robots equipped with cameras and radiation-resistant electronics were sent into the damaged buildings. Many robots failed because radiation levels were so high that their electronic systems stopped functioning. Engineers had to develop entirely new technologies capable of operating under conditions rarely encountered anywhere else in the world. The cleanup operation quickly became one of the most expensive industrial projects in history. The Japanese government, together with TEPCO and international experts, developed a decommissioning plan expected to take several decades. Removing melted nuclear fuel, dismantling damaged reactors, managing radioactive waste, and restoring contaminated areas would require patience, advanced technology, and enormous financial resources. Meanwhile, scientists carefully studied the health effects of the accident. Unlike Chernobyl, where emergency workers received extremely high radiation doses and many suffered acute radiation syndrome, Fukushima presented a different situation. Strict evacuation measures significantly reduced public exposure. According to international scientific organizations, no immediate radiation-related deaths were directly caused by the accident itself. However, the disaster still had profound consequences. The psychological impact on evacuated families was immense. Many people experienced anxiety, depression, uncertainty about the future, and the emotional trauma of losing their homes and communities. Older residents struggled particularly with forced relocation. Some never adapted to life away from their hometowns. The earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident together created one of the most complex humanitarian emergencies in Japan's modern history. Globally, Fukushima changed the conversation about nuclear energy. Governments around the world reviewed the safety of their nuclear power plants. Countries introduced stricter safety standards, improved emergency planning, and strengthened protection against flooding, earthquakes, and prolonged power failures. Some nations accelerated plans to reduce their dependence on nuclear energy. Others invested heavily in upgrading existing reactors. The accident demonstrated that even highly advanced technology cannot eliminate every possible risk. Nature can always exceed human expectations. One of the most important lessons from Fukushima involved the concept of multiple safety barriers. Engineers realized that backup systems must remain operational even during extreme natural disasters occurring simultaneously. Power supplies, cooling systems, communication equipment, and emergency response plans all required additional layers of protection. Today, Fukushima Daiichi remains one of the largest decommissioning projects ever undertaken. Thousands of workers continue operating at the site every day. Advanced robots explore damaged reactor buildings. Engineers remove radioactive debris piece by piece. Scientists constantly monitor radiation levels in the surrounding environment. Although many evacuated areas have gradually reopened, some locations closest to the plant remain heavily restricted. Nature has slowly reclaimed many abandoned neighborhoods. Trees grow through cracked roads. Empty houses stand as silent reminders of the disaster. The events of March 11, 2011, will forever remain one of the defining moments in the history of nuclear energy. What began as one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded quickly became a disaster that tested science, engineering, emergency response, and human resilience. Fukushima was not simply the story of failed machines. It was the story of ordinary people making extraordinary decisions under impossible circumstances. Engineers who stayed behind despite the danger. Firefighters who continued spraying water onto overheating reactors. Medical teams who cared for displaced families. Rescue workers searching through tsunami debris while a nuclear emergency unfolded nearby. Their determination helped prevent an even greater catastrophe. More than a decade later, Fukushima continues to teach valuable lessons about preparedness, transparency, engineering design, and respect for the overwhelming power of nature. It reminds us that technology, no matter how advanced, must always be accompanied by constant vigilance, continuous improvement, and humility. Because history has shown that disasters often occur not from a single failure, but from a chain of unexpected events that no one believed could happen at the same time. The Fukushima disaster remains a powerful reminder that protecting human life must always be the highest priority, and that the lessons learned from tragedy can help build a safer future for generations to come.